why did the myth of the Watchers become as prominent as it did in early Judaism? I think one answer to that is because of its connection to the Day of Atonement and the scapegoat ritual. I think once you understand that, you're going to take this stuff a lot more seriously in your reading of the New Testament. This wasn't just some random sect of apocalyptic-minded Jews who believed this stuff. It was even central at the core of Judaism. And of course, the New Testament has a lot of this influence as well. All right, so in this episode, I'm going to discuss Azazel and his punishment in the Book of First Enoch. This is one of the chief watchers who transgressed a la Genesis 6, and how it's portrayed as a kind of cosmic Day of Atonement. The reason why I'm talking about this is because it's important in a couple passages in the New Testament that I'm going to touch on in future videos, namely the parable of the sheep and the goats, which I just did a video on, but I'm going to do another one on, and then the Gerasene demoniac exorcism in Mark chapter 5. So Matthew 25, parable of the sheep and the goats, Mark 5, Gerasene demoniac, and possibly Revelation 20 as well. Now, it's possible this crops up in other places in the New Testament. In fact, I know it does because I wrote a whole dissertation on it. This lays the groundwork for all of that. Moreover, I think it's important to understand one reason why the Watchers mythology was so prominent in the Second Temple Jewish period was because they had this annual scapegoat ritual that they practiced on the Day of Atonement. Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, was one very special day on the Jewish calendar when Israel's sins got atoned for and purged out of the sanctuary and forgiven. This scapegoat ritual became connected with the punishment of that chief fallen watcher, Azazel, and he's going to become called Azazel as the tradition develops. So you have to think about the scapegoat ritual happening every single year. Pilgrims from the diaspora, Jews who lived abroad, journeying to Jerusalem to partake in the ceremony, Jews in the Holy Land participating. And so every single year, this Watchers myth, and particularly the punishment of the Watchers, was sort of reenacted in the scapegoat ritual. That's going to all become clear as we get into this material. But if you are interested in things pertaining to Enochic traditions, pertaining to the divine council worldview, of course, the Watchers mythology connected to Genesis 6 is very crucial for understanding that whole thing. So I've entitled my slideshow presentation here, Azazel and the Yom Kippur Connection, the Watchers' punishment as cosmic Day of Atonement in the Book of First Enoch. But first things first, we need to understand a little bit about Leviticus 16 and the scapegoat ritual as it's relayed in the biblical text. Who is this Azazel figure that shows up in our Hebrew Bible? He appears to be some counterpart to Yahweh. What? There's a goat for Yahweh and a goat for Azazel? We know that the goat for Yahweh is going to get slaughtered and essentially sacrificed. But what about this goat for Azazel? Is he a sacrifice to some wilderness demon to propitiate some angry deity out there in the desert? Or I'm going to answer those questions for you. But first, let's read through some of Leviticus 16, those verses pertaining to the scapegoat, so that we can understand what it is that the Day of Atonement was accomplishing in the first place. So Leviticus 16, beginning in verse 7. Then he shall take the 2 goats, that is Aaron, the high priest, shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, one lot for Yahweh, and the other lot for Azazel. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for Yahweh, and use it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before Yahweh to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel. And when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place and the tents of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat, and Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel, all their transgressions, all their sins, and he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who is in readiness. And the goat shall bear all their iniquities on itself to a remote area, and he shall let the goat go free into the wilderness. Let's talk a little bit about Yom Kippur. As we just read there are two goats. We have one goat that is going to be immolated, that is slaughtered, and its blood is going to be taken by the high priest into the Holy of Holies, applied on the mercy seat and sprinkled in the Holy of Holies. The high priest, what he's doing with the blood of the goat for Yahweh, and you have to think in different terms here. You have to get your head into this ancient Israelite mentality that sin and impurities could actually stick physically to objects. In this instance, the sins and impurities are attaching to the furniture within the tabernacle. They need to be expunged. The impurities and the sins contaminate the sacred realm or the sacred space where the God Yahweh dwells. And these contaminations need a detergent to sort of soak them up and get rid of them. Most scholars agree on this, and there's not a whole lot of debate. Of course, there's debate over certain aspects of it, but Jacob Milgram's theory about how sin and impurity was thought to physically adhere to the tabernacle, to the physical space, and contaminate it and risk the abscondence of Yahweh's presence because of the buildup and compiling of impurity and sin in that sacred space. I mean, that's pretty well accepted within the Hebrew Bible scholarship. And so you have to understand that the blood of the immolated goat, the blood of the goat for Yahweh, it's taken care of all those impurities. So once the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies and throughout the sanctuary and applies the blood of the sacrificial goat or the goat for Yahweh, then he's going to go over to the scapegoat. Now, the scapegoat has a different function than the goat for Yahweh. The goat for Yahweh, as we saw, it's a chatat offering. It's referred to as a sin offering, a chatat offering. But the scapegoat is not a sacrifice. It is not slaughtered. It's not immolated. It's not used to propitiate anybody's wrath or anger. All that we read here is describing how these sins are physically getting placed upon this goat, this living goat, again, who's not going to get slaughtered. He's just going to get vanquished from the sacred space, carrying the sins. Now, these are the sins wrought with a high hand. These are the moral sins, the defiant sins, more like the criminal acts, which the blood of the goat for Yahweh could not expunge. And so they have to get physically banished out of the sacred realm into the domain of demons, into the wilderness. Okay, that is what the role of the scapegoat was. And that's exactly how it's described in Leviticus 16, which we just read. The goat shall bear all their iniquities on itself to a remote area. Those sins are now gone. Now Yahweh's presence can reside in the tabernacle, in the temple, and God can be with his people because the buildup and compounding of sin in the sacred realm got dealt with. Once a year, it gets dealt with. And yes, by the way, the people do have a role in this ritual. They are to repent, afflict themselves. Their own sin is going to get forgiven during this Day of Atonement as well. Now we got to talk about this Azazel figure. And who is Azazel? Well, a lot has been written about Azazel, and the common consensus is that Azazel is some kind of wilderness deity. He is not accepting a sacrifice, like the scapegoat is not some kind of sacrifice or propitiation or appeasement offering or anything like that. As David Wright talks about in his book, The Disposal of Impurity, and he looks at a lot of Near Eastern parallel rituals, Hittite, Mesopotamian. And a lot of those rituals, you do have wilderness deities, but they are accepting offerings to be appeased so that they would stop sickness from coming upon a camp or a plague from endangering a tribe. In Leviticus 16, Azazel doesn't do anything like that. And Azazel is just there kind of as this random wilderness deity, but there's not much detail about him. However, there are a few things that we can say about this figure Azazel. I want to run through those real quick. The first is that the words Yahweh and Azazel, these words are set in direct parallelism in verse 8 of Leviticus 16, which suggests that this figure Azazel is in fact a name. It's a personal pronoun, just like Yahweh is a name. So if I share my screen with you here, you can see the Hebrew text down below, how these two lines set in parallelism jump out at you. You have similar structure and phraseology, one lot for Yahweh, one lot for Azazel. You have the use of lamed, the preposition lamed, before the word Yahweh and before the word Azazel. And you have the same structure, goral, echad, for Yahweh. So that's one lot for Yahweh. Vagoral, echad, la'azazel. One lot for Azazel. So if you know anything about biblical Hebrew, parallelism is pretty significant, and when you come across it, it's usually intentional. Also, the wilderness was the abode of evil spirits, as was commonly believed, including sa'ir, or goat demons. This term sa'ir shows up in Leviticus 17 in the next chapter in Leviticus, where it's written, "So they shall no more sacrifice their sacrifices to goat demons, after whom they whore." So apparently the Israelites were making sacrifices to goat demons, sa'ir, and these goat demons were thought to dwell in the wilderness. In 2 Chronicles chapter 11, you have the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, Jeroboam, appointing his own priests and his own high places and sacrificing to goat idols, this term sa'ir. I don't have it here on the screen, but I believe it's Isaiah 13 that talks about Babylon, how it's going to become desolate and like a desert. And in the desert of Babylon, there's going to be sa'ir, there's going to be goats or goat demons or something to that effect. And so you have a connection between the wilderness and some kind of demonic goat figures, which points to Azazel being a wilderness deity. The third point here is that the Hebrew word Azazel may be a metastasized form or just an evolved form of another Hebrew word, Azazel, which means strong God or fierce God. So the etymology of the name Azazel likely points to this wilderness deity concept. The fourth point here is that many analogous expulsion rites, that is, rituals where you have a casting away of evil or a sickness or something, they involve wilderness deities. Some of these rituals do share resemblances with the scapegoat ritual. One example is this Hittite ritual of a Shelah, where a community drives away a plague by tying colored ribbons of wool onto the horns of some rams and then sending these rams into the open country, the wilderness, to appease these gods so that the plague would be vanquished from amongst the tribe. So those are some points that draw the conclusion, in my mind, that the Azazel of Leviticus 16 is a deity of some kind. And here I want to read a quote from David P. Wright, who in his book, The Disposal of Impurity, really fantastic book, summarizes it very well. So I'm going to read a summary from him. He says, Azazel should be viewed as a demon, as the etymology of the name suggests. but perhaps as an inactive demon with no real role to play in the rite except to indicate the place to which the sins are dispatched. The scapegoat is not an offering to Azazel. The goat is not sacrificed to Azazel. It's merely sent to Azazel. Furthermore, the animal is not decorated to make it an attractive offering to Azazel, as are living appeasement offerings in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, which we read a little bit about, that ritual of Ashela, other Hittite rituals and Mesopotamian rituals. They are dressing up these scapegoats. In some instances, they're like figurines or even a mouse in one of the Hittite rituals. They'll dress them up and send them off to these deities to appease them, to make them sort of look nice and a pleasant offering so that the gods will stop the plagues. Now, this doesn't happen in Leviticus 16. Continuing on with rite, he says, the goat only serves to transport the sins of Israel away from the habitation. Azazel has been stripped of his personality. He represents little more than the place or goal of disposal. So to summarize here, Azazel, he's a deity of the wilderness, but with little to no role to play in the biblical scapegoat ritual. That's in the biblical scapegoat ritual. And virtually no personality or backstory to accompany him. Now, this is going to change dramatically in the Second Temple period. And as the Old Testament comes to a close and you have that intertestamental period where there's a lot more writing and pondering about evil spirits and fallen angels, Azazel is going to take on a much more grandiose personality. So let's make our way on over to 1st Enoch to discuss how Azazel gets cast in this role as a cosmic scapegoat. So we're going to be focusing in on 1st Enoch chapter 10. We've already learned about the Watchers' descent from heaven, their swearing an oath on Mount Hermon to go down to the sons of men, bear these half-breed giants that wreak destruction on the earth. And Azazel is accused of teaching all kinds of mysteries and iniquities to mankind to corrupt them in their ways, so iniquity increases dramatically on the earth. There's lots of bloodshed, and then the cries of mankind go up to God, and the angels intercede, and then God is going to command these archangels to cast these fallen watchers, these rebels of the divine council, into a place of eschatological punishment. Now, here we are in 1st Enoch chapter 10. So we've done all that, and now Raphael's going to be told to go and punish Azazel. So I'm going to read from the book of 1st Enoch. Go, Raphael, and bind Azazel hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the wilderness that is in Dudael. Throw him there, and lay beneath him sharp and jagged stones, and cover him with darkness, and let him dwell there for an exceedingly long time. Cover up his face, and let him not see the light. And on the day of the great judgment, he will be led away to the burning conflagration, and heal the earth, which the watchers have desolated, and announce the healing of the earth, that the plague may be healed, and all the sons of men may not perish, because of the mystery that the watchers told and taught their sons. And all the earth was made desolate by the deeds of the teaching of Azazel, and over him write all the sins. Now jumping ahead to verse 20. Cleanse the earth from all impurity, and from all wrong, and from all lawlessness, and from all sin, and godlessness, and all impurities that have come upon the earth, remove. And all the sons of men will become righteous, and all the peoples will worship me, and all will bless me and prostrate themselves, and all the earth will be cleansed from all defilement and from all uncleanness, and I shall not again send upon them any wrath or scourge for all the generations of eternity. So you probably heard some echoes of the Day of Atonement in the language of purgation of sin, especially in the latter half of 1 Enoch 10 that we just read there. But let's talk about a couple things before we get into some of the weeds on this. The first thing that I want to mention is the fact that the names Azazel and Azazel are two distinct names. However, there is a similarity between the names. This is point number 2 on the screen here. You can see the Aramaic name Azazel, 2 variations of that, and then the Hebrew name Azazel on the right-hand side of the screen. They are 2 distinct names, but there are some similarities between them as well. We've already discussed how Azazel was regarded as a deity or demon of the wilderness in Israel's religious history, so there's that connection between Azazel and Azazel. But more importantly here, and I think a stronger case can be made with this third point, which is that Second Temple Jewish writers, some of them identified these 2 figures. So in the Qumran texts, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a text called Ages of Creation, 4Q 180, 181. And here, the fallen angel is explicitly called Azazel. This fragmentary text reads, "And the interpretation concerning Azazel and the angels who came to the daughters of man and sired themselves giants, and concerning Azazel is written, to love injustice and let him inherit evil for all his age." So in this Qumran text, we have the fallen angel being described as Azazel from Leviticus 16. Not only that, we have Azazel now inheriting evil for all his age. In other words, he's taken on evil. He's taken on this punishment. There seems to be a scapegoat role even in this Qumran fragment being attributed to the chief watcher, now called Azazel. In the Book of Giants, we have another attribution of the name Azazel to the chief fallen watcher. Then he punished not us, but Azazel. Now here's the spelling from the Masoretic text in Leviticus 16, and made him the sons of watchers, the giants, and none of their beloved will be forgiven. That accords with the book of 1 Enoch, when the watchers seek forgiveness from God but are rejected. He has imprisoned us and has captured you. Then we have the apocalypse of Abraham in chapter 13 and 14. Now this is a later text, however, likely dates to the 1st century AD, maybe early 2nd century AD, and contains traditions that predate that, probably back into the Second Temple period. Here in this Slavonic apocalypse, the apocalypse of Abraham, the angel Yahweh curses Azazel. Now, this figure, Azazel, appears to have this scapegoat function as well. He says, "Reproach is on you, Azazel, for the garments which in heaven were formerly yours have been set aside for Abraham, and the corruption which was on Abraham has gone over to you, Azazel," like a scapegoat, right? "May you be the firebrand of the furnace of the earth. Go, Azazel, into the untrodden parts of the earth," which is reminiscent of Azazel's casting out into this hole in the wilderness, into this abyss. So there's a connection even in the apocalypse of Abraham. But let's hone in on 1 Enoch chapter 10 a little bit more, dive into this passage, and I'm going to give you 10 points of correspondence between 1 Enoch 10 and the Day of Atonement. The Book of Watchers cast Azazel's punishment as a cosmic day of atonement. Here are 10 points to demonstrate the case. The first is that the corporate sins of a group are placed upon the scapegoat and upon Azazel. In 1 Enoch chapter 10, the angel Raphael is told to write all sins upon him, that is, upon Azazel. So Raphael is to inscribe all the sins, apparently of the other watchers, maybe of the humans who transgressed as well. We're not told exactly, but all the sins of a corporate group are to be placed upon Azazel, the chief watcher, before he is cast into the cosmic abyss. In Leviticus 16, Aaron confesses upon the scapegoat all of the iniquities of Israel, all their transgressions, all their sins, and the goat shall take upon itself all their iniquities. So there is a taking on of sin with regard to both figures, the scapegoat and Azazel. Now, the location of the punishment for both the scapegoat and for Azazel is the wilderness. This Greek term eremos, which in Greek 1 Enoch, the Greek fragments that we have, and in the Septuagint of Leviticus 16, those are the same words. So in 1 Enoch 10, Raphael is told to make an opening in the wilderness, that's in Dudael, and throw Azazel there. Azazel is to be thrown in a hole in the desert, in an abyss, which is not just anywhere, it's actually in a wilderness. You go out into a wilderness, and then there's a hole out in that wilderness. That's where the abyss is. That is reminiscent of Leviticus 16. Obviously, the scapegoat is sent into the wilderness, or the eremos, bearing the sins of the children of Israel out into the domain of demons. The third parallel is this catalog of sins that are placed upon the scapegoat. Similarly, there's a catalog of sins that Raphael is commanded to cleanse from the earth due to the sin of the watchers. So in Leviticus 16, verse 21, Aaron shall confess over the scapegoat all the iniquities of the sons of Israel, all of their transgressions, and all their sins. In 1 Enoch, verse 20, Raphael's told to cleanse the earth from all impurity and from all wrongdoing and from all lawlessness and from all sin. Do you hear the verbal echo of this catalog of types of iniquity? There's even some actual verbal parallelism between the two texts if you look at the Greek on my screen. Okay, next, the scapegoat's expulsion and Azazel's expulsion both result in cleansing. Katharizo is the Greek term here, cleansing from sin and impurity. Leviticus 16, verse 30, it reads, "For on this day shall atonement be made for you to cleanse you, and you shall be clean before the Lord from all your sins." In 1 Enoch 10, verses 21 and 22, it says that all the earth will be cleansed from all the defilements and from all uncleanness, and I shall not again send upon them any wrath or scourge for all the generations of eternity. Again, taking a look at my screen, you see that term katharizo, to clean or to cleanse, occur in both passages. This is a trope in both 1 Enoch 10 and in Leviticus 16, the cleansing of the earth and the cleansing of the people from their sins. The fifth parallel is that both figures are cast down into an abyss of some kind. So Azazel is hurled downward into an opening in the desert. Raphael is told to cast Azazel into the darkness and make an opening in the wilderness, throw him there and cover him with darkness, cover up his face, let him not see the light. So he is going deep down somewhere into an abyss, we'll call it, in the wilderness. He's taking a descent downward into the underworld, into that nether regions of the earth. What's interesting is that when you look at Second Temple traditions that describe the scapegoat ritual, you get a similar concept. In the Mishnah, in Mishnah Yoma 6, which was written around 200 AD, but these traditions certainly predate that. They go back into the Second Temple period. It describes the scapegoat being pushed from behind once it was sent into the desert, and that the scapegoat, when it was pushed, would go rolling down a hill, which means that it was pushed off of a hill or off of a precipice of some kind. In the Targums, you have a similar attestation to this tradition. In Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, Leviticus 16, it reads that the goat shall go up on the mountains, and a blast of wind from before the Lord will thrust him down, thrust the scapegoat down, and the scapegoat will actually perish, which isn't something you find in Leviticus 16, but apparently this became a tradition that the Jews would enact during the Day of Atonement. They'd actually push the scapegoat down a ravine or a precipice so that the scapegoat would perish. Well, that sounds a lot like Azazel being cast into an abyss to his demise in the wilderness in 1 Enoch chapter 10. And the sixth parallel is that Azazel is bound. He's bound, which recalls the binding of a scarlet band around the head of the scapegoat. Again, in other traditions that crop up describing the ritual as it was actually performed by Jews in the Second Temple period. In 1 Enoch 10, Raphael is to go and bind Azazel hand and foot. This binding of the watchers and of Azazel in particular shows up in multiple different places in the book of 1 Enoch and in the book of Jubilees and in other places in Second Temple literature. This trope of binding is interesting because it's attested in multiple places, and you can see them referenced here on my screen. Again, in the Mishnah, in a couple different books in the Mishnah, Mishnah Yoma and Mishnah Shabbat, also in Tertullian and Hippolytus. But here I have the Epistle of Barnabas, which probably late 1st century, early 2nd century AD, but Barnabas is very keen to different Jewish traditions, and he references some Jewish traditions that date back to the Second Temple period before the temple was destroyed 70 AD. And here Barnabas says this. He says that, what will they do with the other? The other, he says, is cursed. Now he's talking about the other goat, the scapegoat. He's actually quoting some halakhic materials from the Second Temple period that got preserved in the Epistle of Barnabas. This is really cool stuff because he's drawing a Christological reading from the Second Temple traditions of the scapegoat, drawing some implications for Christology. He says, pay attention to how the type of Jesus is revealed. And then he quotes the halakhic Jewish tradition here. He says, and all of you shall spit upon the scapegoat and pierce it and wrap a piece of scarlet wool around its head. That's not in Leviticus 16, but apparently this was what was happening with the scapegoat during the Second Temple era as it was actually performed. So you have this binding element, the binding of Azazel and the binding of a scarlet ribbon around the scapegoat's head. The seventh parallel is that Azazel is placed on sharp and jagged stones in verse 5 of chapter 10 of 1 Enoch. Some textual variants say that sharp and jagged stones are placed on Azazel. Doesn't really matter for our purposes here. The point is that we have traditions from early Judaism that indicate that the place where the scapegoat was actually sent in the wilderness was a rough kind of place. One text to demonstrate this is the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, Leviticus 16. Yes, this is a somewhat later text here, but likely this tradition dates back to the Second Temple period because it's not only attested here, you even find a reference to this in Philo. This passage reads that the scapegoat shall be sent to die in a rough and stony place, which is in the desert of Sok, which is Beth Haduri. So you have a trope of Azazel and the scapegoat being sent into this sort of rugged terrain, rocky terrain, or something to that effect. The eighth parallel is the treatment of Azazel being harsh and severe, which brings to mind the scapegoat's treatment being harsh and severe as well. Again, you have to look at the Second Temple traditions regarding that scapegoat ritual. Multiple different sources indicate that the scapegoat was actually physically and verbally abused on its way out of Jerusalem. Again, in the Mishnah, they made a causeway for the scapegoat, and they pulled its hair and cried, "Bear our sins, be gone, bear our sins, be gone." In Barnabas, we read that the scapegoat was spit on and pierced even on its way out of the city. And in the Apocalypse of Abraham, the angel Yahweh verbally berates and reprimands Azazel, saying, "Reproaches on you, Azazel." And so this verbal beratement is abusive, just like Azazel's treatment is harsh and severe in 1 Enoch 10. The ninth point of reference is Enoch's ascent into the heavenly throne room in 1 Enoch chapter 14. So a few chapters later, Enoch is going to ascend into this cosmic temple up in the heavens. And that's going to remind us of the high priest's entrance into the Holy of Holies, which happened when? On the Day of Atonement. So you have this upward movement of Enoch and this downward movement of Azazel into the abyss in the wilderness, which Andrei Orlov talks about this being a trope that comes out of the Yom Kippur tradition of the two goats. You see it in different texts. Basically, you have the goat for Yahweh kind of ascending up into the Holy of Holies, its blood being presented before Yahweh in the tabernacle or temple. Then you have the scapegoat being cast out into the least sacred place, the domain of demons, the wilderness, and even being pushed downward into a ravine. So you have a diametrically opposed spatial movement of the two goats. And finally, there is a linguistic connection between the locale of Azazel's punishment being called Dudael and the locale of the scapegoat's final destination, which is said to be in several texts a place called Beth Hadudo. I'm not going to get into that here, but there's an article there if you want to reference that on my screen. And so there are 10 points of correspondence between the Day of Atonement and Day of Atonement traditions and 1 Enoch chapter 10. So what are we to make of these parallels and the casting of Azazel as a cosmic scapegoat, as this Azazel figure from Leviticus 16? I'd like to read a quote from a scholar whose name is Stekel Ben Ezra, who's written a lot on this topic, because it's going to highlight one of the key takeaways that I want to emphasize in this episode. So Ben Ezra writes, "These arguments corroborate the claim of an influence of Leviticus 16 and the Yom Kippur temple rite on 1 Enoch 10, or at least on its formulation and reception from the 2nd century onward, if not the original version of the narrative. The primordial and eschatological history of sin become part of Yom Kippur's imaginaire in Jewish apocalyptic groups, and the myth also reveals one of the rationales behind the ritual. The annual Yom Kippur was perceived, at least by some, as a ritual anticipation of the eschatological purification of God's creation from sin." I want to read that one more time. "The annual Yom Kippur was perceived as a ritual anticipation of the eschatological purification of God's creation from sin." He says the goat originally sent to Azazel was seen as the personification of Azazel, the demonic source of sin, a la the Watchers mythology. This explains why the people mistreated the scapegoat on its way out of the city. It's illuminating the yearly cult as a pre-enactment of the final eschatological decision. I really like what Ben Ezra writes here, because you just have to imagine the Yom Kippur scapegoat ritual happening yearly, reminding people of the myth of the Watchers, of Azazel's punishment for what he did back in Genesis 6. Every single year, this gets concretized in the minds of some Jewish writers and Jewish thinkers who are going to have an influence eventually in the New Testament period. This became a big deal. I mean, what holy days are more important than the Day of Atonement, right? You have several very important holy days. We'll probably put Passover in there being among one of the most prominent, but the Day of Atonement, so crucial for the preserving of Yahweh's presence among his people. This is a very crucial day on the calendar for most Second Temple Jews. So why did the myth of the Watchers become as prominent as it did in early Judaism? I think one answer to that is because of its connection to the Day of Atonement and the scapegoat ritual. I think once you understand that, you're going to take this stuff a lot more seriously in your reading of the New Testament. This wasn't just some random sect of apocalyptic-minded Jews who believed this stuff. It was even central at the core of Judaism. And of course, the New Testament has a lot of this influence as well. So we'd be wise to be privy to this kind of thing. Now, before we wrap up, I would be remiss if I didn't mention two other texts from the Second Temple period where we see a connection between the Day of Atonement and the myth of the Watchers. The first one I want to mention, I'll just mention these briefly, is the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees, probably written around the time of the Book of the Watchers, probably a little bit after that, but not too much after that. In chapter 5 of the Book of Jubilees, you have the entire myth of the Watchers narrated. The author then goes on to give us an etiology, basically how this ritual came about, like its beginning of the Day of Atonement. So literally after he narrates the fall of the Watchers and the punishment, then he goes into, oh, by the way, this is how the Day of Atonement came to become a thing. So it's an implicit connection between the myth of the Watchers and the Day of Atonement, but it's a pretty clear connection. Here in verses 17 and 18 on my screen, I'll read, regarding the Israelites, it's been written and ordained, if they turn to him in the right way, he will forgive all their wickedness and pardon all their sins. Okay? It's been written and ordained that he will have mercy on all who turn from all their errors once each year. That's a reference to the Day of Atonement, which occurs once each year. And if you look at the rest of the text on my screen, here the author is narrating the sins of the Watchers and their punishment right before he goes into this etiology of Yom Kippur. Finally, we should talk about 11Q Melchizedek. Now, this is a Qumran text, very interesting text. It's a pesher, that means it's sort of an interpretation of several biblical passages. We have this figure, Melchizedek, a heavenly priestly figure at the end of days who's going to judge the enemies of God, that is Belial and his spirits. Melchizedek is going to come at the end of days, after 9 Jubilee periods, and on the Day of Atonement, he's going to come at the end of the 10th Jubilee period. These Jubilee periods indicate sacred time, eschatological consummation. And on this Day of Atonement, this eschatological Day of Atonement, he shall atone for all the sons of light and the people who are predestined to Melchizedek. So all of Melchizedek's lot, those who are predestined, will have their sins forgiven on this eschatological Day of Atonement. And this is going to be the year of grace of Melchizedek. And he will, by his strength, judge the holy ones of God. He's going to judge the Watchers, the fallen angels, the holy ones, executing judgment as it is written concerning him in the songs of David. Now, guess what he quotes? He quotes Psalm 82. Psalm 82 is a psalm about God's judgment of the sons of God, the rebellious sons of God. So he goes on to quote Psalm 82:1, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. The interpretation concerns Belial and the spirits of his lot. Who do you think the spirits of Belial's lot are? Of course, Belial is sort of the devil figure for the author of 11Q Melchizedek, and for a lot of the Qumran material, Belial is sort of the chief angelic antagonist, sort of the Azazel figure or the devil figure. And his spirits, who do you think they are? They're the spirits of the bastard children of the Watchers who got destroyed in the flood and who roamed the earth. So Belial and his spirits are going to get judged on this eschatological Day of Atonement. So we have a pretty clear connection between Yom Kippur and the Watchers myth in 11Q Melchizedek. And there's the text there for anybody who's interested in reading that text for themselves. So let's draw some conclusions here. The yearly Day of Atonement scapegoat ritual would have helped solidify Azazel's place in the collective imagination and theology of Palestinian Jews living in the Second Temple period. The fact that the goat for Azazel becomes associated with Azazel, the chief fallen watcher, it solidifies the myth of the Watchers in the imagination of Jews living in the Second Temple period. Now, the prominence of the Watchers myth in Second Temple Judaism is likely due in part to the annual reenactment of the eschatological fates of the fallen watchers as described in First Enoch, but then as sort of enacted in the scapegoat ritual. So finally, to understand how the Watchers tradition makes its way into the New Testament, it's going to be important to grasp the full array of traditions associated with Yom Kippur as they become connected to the myth of the fallen Watchers. So a few texts here to mention are Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats. My next video is going to continue outlining how Matthew utilizes Enoch in that parable, so that's going to come into play there in my next video. Mark chapter 5, I'll do a series on Mark 5 and the Gerasene exorcism. That's also a place where one of the gospel writers seems to be privy to this Watchers mythology and even the Yom Kippur elements of it. Then Jesus' own struggle against the devil and the Passion narrative. My whole dissertation was on this topic, mostly in Matthew 27, 28. And I'll talk more about that in the future as well. So these are just some examples, and I'm sure there are others that I haven't even realized. And, maybe in your reading of the New Testament, you'll be reading the text one day and you'll say, oh my gosh, this kind of reminds me of some of the stuff that Hans was talking about with Enoch and the Day of Atonement. Maybe there's a connection here. So I'm just putting this out there. This is going to lay the groundwork for some subsequent videos, and I'll be able to make reference to this video without having to explain this whole thing every single time going forward. So thanks for watching this. I know it was a lot of content, but we will reap a great reward from it. My next video, back to the parable of the sheep and the goats. Going to be some really cool stuff talking about Matthew's employment of Day of Atonement traditions as it pertains to his use of Enoch and Watchers material there. So stay tuned. Thank you for watching. See you on the next one.